So I was recently down in Phoenix, Arizona at a conference, and I thought it would be a fun learning opportunity to create a Vue.js application that would count down to when I would be back home in my own bed. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to do this because I did it in the hours before my flight to the conference. But the idea is you would have a form here to input a date. So for example, let's do March 5th, and let's say 11:15 a.m. And this would essentially represent the date at which I would be back home. I hit start counting. You can see I now have the UTC milliseconds of that target date as a route parameter in the next view. And this now presents me with a page that will start counting down to that March date. You can see 4 sleeps here. That's the number of times that I crossed the midnight line between now and then. And then overall the number of hours, minutes, and seconds. And you can see the seconds are counting down. And in fact, all of these will be counting down. We just went from 45 to 44 minutes. As an additional opportunity to learn, I tried to create a little timer here that would know when I blurred and focused the window. So you can see here it's counting down, and then if I click out, it'll stop the timer due to lack of focus, and then it'll restart the timer due to regained focus. You probably don't need to do this. I believe the browser essentially does this kind of an optimization for you. It throttles timers in the background. But again, I'm learning more about Vue.js. This is the first time I looked at the router. This is the first time I looked at using handlers that are not naturally bound to the component instance. So just, again, a learning opportunity all around. So let's take a quick look at how this works under the hood. So first, I had to import my Vue router, and I define my routes. Now this application really only has 2 routes, the home route and the countdown route. You can see here that I have the UTC milliseconds of the target date as a route parameter inside that route. And then anything that is not one of these routes simply redirects to the home page. And then of course I create my router instance, and I tell the Vue application to use this router as the application router. So this is a native part of the Vue.js ecosystem. Now normally I would be able to say factor some layout between these 2 components into the app component, but in this case I didn't really have the time to think about that. So essentially the home component and the countdown component operate entirely independently, and the app component, which is what I'm rendering here in the root, does absolutely nothing except include my router view. So there's no shared layout, there's no shared functionality. Essentially, I'm either rendering the home component or the countdown component. The home component is where we enter the date. So you can see here I have a form, which I'm using the vmodel bindings to gather the year, month, day, hour, and minute. Again, I really didn't have a lot of time, so I didn't create any kind of fancy input like a calendar, drop-down menus, just some raw input text fields. And in fact, you'll see that there's almost no validation here. When you submit the form, I'm simply parsing those values, making sure that they're integers. If they are integers, I'm using the date constructor to pass in all of the date parts. You can see here I'm adjusting the 0-based month offset to be a 1-based month offset, so that we align properly with the natural human mental model. People don't think about January as being the 0th month. Now once I create that date, you can see then I get the UTC milliseconds of that date, which is then being used to define the next destination of the router. That's going to push the user through to the countdown component. The countdown component is essentially a glorified timer, which you can see outputs the number of sleeps, hours, minutes, and seconds. Now, this is really doing nothing but setting a timer. And if we jump down here to the handle tick, you can see that it simply calls the update countdown. Update countdown uses the countdown calculator and the route params UTC target to figure out how many sleeps, hours, minutes, and seconds. So we're separating here the different responsibilities. The component itself is responsible for managing the timer, but not doing any of the logic around the actual delta calculation between the 2 dates. That's being moved into the countdown calculator so that it can be created and theoretically tested outside of the Vue logic itself. Now, in addition to this being the first time that I've dealt with the router, this is also the first time that I've dealt with functions that get passed outside of the component context. So, for example, things inside the methods collection, these are all naturally executed inside the context of the component. But things like handle blur, handle focus, and handle tick, those aren't being invoked by Vue. Those are actually being invoked by the window event handler in this case, and the set interval in the other case. So when I pass these out of context and out of Vue.js control, they're bound to the global scope, not the component scope. So essentially what I do here in my created lifecycle hook is I take those different handle methods and I use the .bind method to make sure that when they execute in the context of the current this, which is the component instance, which is what allows me to then inside of my handle methods to be able to reference the component instance with this. This feels super janky to me. It reminds me of having to write early React.js code before kind of after that, after React would do this for you automatically. In Angular, we don't have to do this because we use TypeScript and classes, which allows us to essentially define instance methods using the fat arrow function without any kind of ceremony. So I don't know if this is the right way to do it. Again, this is very new to, I'm very new to Vue.js, so but it's just something I'm playing around with. Now let's just take a quick look at the countdown calculator. The countdown calculator does very little. It has a single calculate method with a to date and a from date. And then essentially you can look through this logic on your own, but it uses the to dates to calculate the sleeps, hours, minutes, seconds, and time. You can see that there's some math and some aggregation and some special logic that go into figuring out exactly how many sleeps there are. Because the sleep, I'm considering the sleep to be passing the midnight line, which means that the to and from dates, it's not just the duration of the date, it also includes when it falls. For example, if you have a 25-hour period that starts at 11:30 p.m., it will actually cross two separate 24-hour points. But if you have the same 25-hour period starting at 9 a.m., it only crosses a single midnight line, which means it only has one sleep. So just some special logic. So anyway, again, this was just a learning opportunity for me, sort of a way to harness my social anxiety into something a lot more productive, a learning opportunity here with the Vue.js router, also with methods that aren't naturally bound to the component instance. And I'm sharing this just to share it. Please don't take this as any indication of best practices, and take anything I'm doing here with a grain of salt, as again, I'm just really thinking out loud and learning with Vue.js.